The town of Silverton Ridge lay cradled in the heart of the San Juan Mountains, a place where the wind never stopped whispering through the pines and the earth smelled of gunpowder, whiskey, and regret. It was a town built on gold fever and held together by fear, of the mountains, of the cold, and most of all of the men who ran it. The Golden Mare Saloon stood at the center of it all, its wooden sign creaking in the high wind, its yellow lamps throwing smoky halos onto the muddy street. Every night, miners, drifters, and cowhands gathered beneath that roof to drown themselves in cheap liquor and cheaper lies. The piano in the corner played songs of the East, songs no one remembered the words to anymore. Behind the bar worked Clara May, a woman who'd learned to move quiet and talk little. She wasn't like the painted girls who flirted for tips. There was something different about her, something gentler, something worn. Her hair was the color of prairie wheat, tied up neatly beneath a ribbon that had seen better days. Her limp was faint but constant, and though no one dared ask, everyone knew she'd been hurt once by a man who thought kindness was weakness. Still, Clara smiled. She poured whiskey without spilling a drop, laughed when it was expected, and prayed in silence that each night would pass without trouble. But in Silverton Ridge, trouble always rode in before the dawn. That trouble arrived one bitter evening, when a snowstorm rolled down from the peaks, and a stranger rode into town through the white haze. His horse was black as midnight, his coat made of wolf fur, his rifle slung low across his back. He moved like a man who knew the mountains better than people, a man who'd seen things too wild to ever speak of. When he pushed through the bat-wing doors of the Golden Mare, the music stopped. The laughter died. Every man in the room turned to look. He stood there, tall, broad-shouldered, with a beard thick and streaked with gray. His face was hard-cut, his eyes the color of winter steel. He was a mountain man through and through, and the air around him smelled of pine and danger. "Whiskey," he said, voice low as thunder rolling through a canyon. Clara looked up, and for the first time in years she felt something stir behind her ribs. There was pain in that man's eyes, pain she recognized, the kind that never fully heals. Without a word, she poured him a drink, her hand steady even as Royce Talbot, the saloon's owner, glared from behind the bar. Royce was the kind of man who thought he owned whatever his eyes touched: land, liquor, women. He didn't take kindly to strangers, especially the kind that drew a crowd by just breathing. "That'll be 50 cents. Mister," Clara said, her voice gentle, soft as a lullaby. The stranger reached into his coat, dropped a silver dollar on the counter, and nodded. "Keep the change, ma'am." A murmur ran through the room. No one tipped that kind of money in Silverton Ridge, not unless they were showing off or picking a fight. But Clara only smiled and slid the coin into her apron. Royce leaned forward, chewing his cigar. "Ain't polite to make my girls blush, stranger. Folks might get the wrong idea." The mountain man didn't even look at him. "Ain't trying to make anyone blush," he said. "Just thirsty." The tension in the air thickened like storm clouds. Clara could feel it in her chest, the way men like Royce tried to measure themselves against men like this one, and always came up short. Later that night, as the storm howled outside, the stranger sat alone at a corner table, sipping slow, saying nothing. Clara moved quietly through the room, clearing glasses, humming a tune her mother used to sing. When she passed his table, he spoke. "You got a name?" She hesitated, then said, "Clara May." He nodded once. "I'm Elias Crane." Something in his tone made her pause, a name that sounded carved from stone, the kind of name men whispered about long after he was gone. She'd heard stories of trappers who lived up in the high valleys, men who'd lost everything and come down only when winter made it too hard to survive. "You been in Silverton long?" he asked. "Too long," she said with a faint smile. "And you?" "Not long enough." Their eyes met, and for a fleeting moment the world around them seemed to quiet. The piano stopped. The laughter faded. It was as if two weary souls had recognized something in each other that no one else could see. But good things don't last in Silverton Ridge. Royce watched them from the bar, his jaw tight. He didn't like the way Elias looked at her, didn't like the way Clara smiled back. To him, she wasn't a woman, just property, same as his bottles and his bar. When closing time came, Clara stayed behind to clean. The others left, the wind rattling the shutters. Elias lingered near the doorway, watching her stack chairs and wipe the counter. "You shouldn't be alone here this late," he said. She glanced at him, then at the stairs where Royce's office light still burned. "I'm always alone here," she whispered. Elias hesitated, then set a small leather pouch on the counter. "There's jerky and coffee beans in there, for you." "I can't take that," she said quickly. He shook his head. "Ain't charity. Just to thank you for treating me like a man when most folks don't." For a moment, she thought he might say something more, but instead he tipped his hat and walked out into the snow, his silhouette swallowed by the storm. Clara stood there long after he was gone, staring at the door. Something inside her, something she'd thought was long dead, felt alive again. Hope, maybe, or something close to it. But upstairs, behind that yellow lamp, Royce Talbot had seen it all. He stood at his window, cigar smoke curling around his face, watching Clara as she lingered by the door. His eyes narrowed. He didn't like it, not one bit. By morning, word had spread through the town. "The mountain man's back," they whispered. "Elias Crane. Heard he killed a man once in Kansas over a woman. Heard he don't take kindly to lawmen." Clara tried to ignore the talk, tried to keep her head down and her hands busy. But every time the saloon door opened, her heart leapt, hoping it was him. And when he did walk in again 3 nights later, covered in trail dust and cold wind, she couldn't help the small smile that tugged at her lips. He returned it. Barely. A flicker of warmth in a world made of ice. Yet in the corner, Royce Talbot watched, his anger brewing like black coffee. He knew what men like Elias Crane could do. Knew they couldn't be controlled, couldn't be bought. And he'd be damned if some backwoods trapper made a fool out of him in his own saloon. As the night drew on, and the piano played soft, Elias leaned forward, his eyes fixed on Clara as she poured his drink. "Thank you," he said again, low enough for only her to hear. She met his gaze and whispered back, "You don't owe me thanks, Elias." Outside, the snow kept falling, soft, endless, and white as forgiveness. Neither of them knew it yet, but that night was the beginning of something that would change both their lives forever. Morning came gray and bitter, the kind of cold that crept into a man's bones and stayed there. Silverton Ridge lay under a thin sheet of frost, smoke rising from chimneys, the air thick with the smell of wood and whiskey. The town looked peaceful from the outside, but behind every shutter and saloon door lived stories soaked in fear. Elias Crane spent that morning in the livery barn, fixing the broken axle on his wagon. His horse, a black stallion named Boone, snorted steam into the cold air as he worked. The rhythmic clang of hammer against iron echoed off the frozen walls. But even as he worked, Elias's mind wasn't on the axle. It kept drifting back to her, Clara May, the saloon maid with eyes too kind for a place like this. He'd only known her a night, maybe 2, yet something about her voice, her quiet grace had stayed with him like a lingering note of a sad song. He hadn't felt that in years. Not since before the fever took his wife and child, leaving him with nothing but wilderness for company. Around noon, a boy from town passed by, tugging his hat nervously. "You heard what happened at the Golden Mare, mister?" Elias didn't look up from his work. "Can't say I have. They say Miss Clara fell down the stairs last night. Hurt herself bad." Elias froze. The hammer slipped from his fingers, clattering onto the ground. "Fell?" he repeated, though the word felt wrong in his mouth. The boy nodded. "That's what Mr. Talbot said. Told Doc Harper she's not to be disturbed." The mountain man's jaw tightened. He knew a lie when he heard one. A fall might bruise a woman, but it didn't sound like something Royce Talbot would be concerned about, unless he'd caused it himself. Elias wiped his hands, fed Boone a handful of oats, and walked out into the street. His steps were slow, deliberate, his eyes fixed on the saloon at the end of the dusty road. Inside the Golden Mare, the air was different, quieter. The piano sat untouched. A few miners drank silently, glancing up only long enough to see Elias come through the door. Royce Talbot stood behind the bar, polishing a glass that didn't need polishing, a sneer already curling his lips. "Well, if it ain't the mountain ghost himself," Royce said. "Didn't think the snow let you out of your cave yet." Elias ignored the jab. His voice came out calm. "Where's the girl with the braid?" Royce stopped polishing. "What girl?" "Clara May." Royce's grin spread, wolfish. "She's done. Fell and broke her legs last night. Poor thing can't even walk now. Guess she won't be much use to me or anyone else." Elias's fingers curled into fists at his sides. "You do that to her?" Royce's eyes flashed. Careful what you're asking, friend. I don't take kindly to accusations in my place of business. The room tensed. Two of Royce's hired hands shifted near the card table, their hands brushing the butts of their pistols. Elias's voice stayed low, steady, like distant thunder. You best tell me where she is. Royce leaned forward on the bar. She ain't your concern. She's lucky I let her live. Now drink your whiskey and be on your way, mountain man. Elias's gaze lingered a moment longer, then he turned and walked out. The saloon doors swung shut behind him, but his anger burned hotter than the wind outside. He didn't go far, just around back, where the snow lay untouched except for a few fresh boot tracks leading to a side shed. He followed them quietly, his instincts honed by years of hunting. Inside, through the thin crack of the wooden door, he saw the faint flicker of lamplight. He pushed the door open. There she was. Clara lay on a rough cot, wrapped in a blanket that looked older than she was. Her legs were bound in crude splints, bruises blooming along her skin like dark flowers. Her hair was undone, falling around her pale face. When she saw him, her eyes widened with both relief and shame. Elias, she whispered, her voice trembling. You shouldn't be here. He stepped inside, closing the door softly behind him. They told me you fell. Her lips quivered. That's what Royce said. He nodded once. Clara turned her face away, tears glistening in her eyes. He's lying. Her voice caught. They broke my legs, Elias, for serving you. The words hit him like a bullet. He knelt beside her, hands trembling slightly as he brushed her hair from her face. Why? What kind of man would... Royce said I embarrassed him, she whispered. Said I made his saloon look soft, like it had rules. He told me to stay away from you. And when I didn't, he made sure I couldn't walk to your table again. Elias swallowed hard, rage building in his chest, thick and choking. He'll pay for this. She reached for his hand, her touch weak but steady. No, don't. You'll only make it worse. That man owns this town, Elias. He's got the sheriff, the guns, the fear. I just want to heal. That's all? He stared at her, this woman who'd been beaten, broken, and still spoke of peace. You ain't safe here, he said. You'll never be safe while that man breathes. Clara tried to smile, but it faltered. I've lived in fear so long I don't remember what safe feels like. Elias rose slowly, his shadow filling the small shed. Then I'll remind you. She shook her head, eyes glassy. Why do you care, Elias? You don't even know me. He paused at the door, voice low and raw, because someone once hurt the woman I loved, and I wasn't there to stop it. I won't make that mistake again. For a moment, silence hung heavy between them. Then he turned and walked out into the cold, snowflakes melting against his skin like burning coals. That night, Elias didn't return to the saloon. He camped on the ridge above town, the firelight flickering against his hard face. Boone grazed nearby, restless. The mountains loomed dark and endless around him. He sat there for hours, staring into the flames, hearing Clara's words over and over. They broke my legs for serving you. He could still see her face, pale and bruised, and the way her voice trembled not from fear but from shame, as though she'd done something wrong by showing kindness. The rage inside him was like the storm building in the peaks. Silent now, but ready to break. By dawn, a plan had taken shape in his mind. He'd seen too many good souls crushed by men like Royce Talbot, men who thought cruelty was strength. If the law wouldn't protect Clara, then he would. He packed his gear, saddled Boone, and looked down at the sleeping town below. Smoke rose from the chimneys, peaceful and gray, but Elias knew what festered beneath that calm. He whispered to the wind, You don't break a woman like that and walk away. Then, as the sun broke over the ridge, he rode down toward town, not as a man seeking trouble, but as a man who'd already found it. Back in the shed, Clara woke to the sound of distant hooves fading into the mountains. She didn't know where he'd gone, but she felt it in her heart. Elias Crane was a man who didn't make promises with words. He made them with deeds. And somewhere deep down, beneath her pain, a fragile hope began to grow, the kind that even broken legs couldn't crush. The storm came down from the mountains like God's own fury that night, snow slashing sideways, the wind screaming through the pines like a chorus of ghosts. Inside the shed behind the golden mare, Clara lay awake, her body aching, her heart heavy with dread. She'd heard footsteps outside earlier, men laughing, the sound of boots crunching in the snow, and she knew Royce Talbot's kind didn't like leaving loose ends. Every groan of the boards, every howl of the wind made her flinch. She could still hear Royce's voice from the night before, low and venomous. "You bring shame on my house again, girl. I'll make sure you never stand again." He'd already made good on that promise once, but out there in the white darkness, someone was coming. At first she thought it was her mind playing tricks, the crunch of hooves, the faint glint of a lantern cutting through the snow. Then she heard it again. A deep, steady tread, the kind of stride that belonged to a man who didn't scare easy. When the door burst open, wind and snow swirling inside, Clara gasped and tried to sit up. It was him, Elias Crane. His coat was dusted white, his beard rimed with frost, his eyes burned through the storm. "You ready to get out of hell, Clara May?" he said quietly. She stared, trembling. "You can't. If Royce finds out—" "He's already found out," Elias growled. "And that's why we're leaving, tonight." Before she could argue, he was beside her, lifting her from the cot as though she weighed no more than a bundle of feathers. She cried out as pain shot through her legs, but he hushed her softly. "I got you," he said. "Ain't nobody gonna hurt you again." He wrapped her in his thick fur coat, carried her out into the snow, and set her gently across the saddle before mounting behind her. The wind cut like knives, but he didn't slow down. Boone snorted steam into the darkness as they rode north, the town fading behind them like a bad dream. The storm swallowed them whole. Hours later, they reached a narrow trail that wound up into the high country, a path only Elias knew. The snow was knee-deep, the pines bending under its weight. Clara's head rested weakly against his chest, her breath shallow. "Almost there," he murmured, though he wasn't sure if she heard him. By the time they reached his cabin, a lonely log shelter tucked against the mountain shoulder, the storm was a living beast. He pushed open the door, carried her inside, and laid her on a bed of furs by the fire. For the first time in days, she felt warmth. Elias stoked the flames higher, the light dancing over the room, a rough space but sturdy and warm. The walls were lined with pelts, tools, and a few keepsakes, a woman's locket, a small wooden horse carved by hand, and above the hearth, a rifle polished with care. When she stirred, he knelt beside her with a bowl of snowmelt and a cloth. "Let me see them legs," he said softly. She hesitated, then nodded. He unwrapped the splints carefully, his hand steady but his jaw tight as he saw the bruises. He cleaned the wounds, wrapped them again with fresh linen, and set a poultice made from mountain herbs, comfrey and yarrow. "You'll walk again," he said. "Might take time, but you will." Tears welled in her eyes. "You sound so sure," he met her gaze. "I know what it looks like when a person gives up, Clara. You ain't there yet." For a long while she said nothing. The fire crackled between them, throwing light over their faces. "Why did you do this?" she finally whispered. "You barely know me." Elias leaned back, staring into the flames. "'Cause I know what it's like to be left behind. My wife, Hannah, she got sick when we were living out near the Bitterroots. Fever took her and the boy in 2 days. The dock was 100 miles away, and the snow came early that year. By the time I got there, it was too late." He paused, his voice rough. "After that, I quit people. Figured the mountains were safer company. But when I saw what Royce did to you, it felt like I was watching it all happen again. Only this time I wasn't about to stand still." Clara's heart clenched. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "Don't be," he muttered. "You didn't do nothing wrong. World just breaks good folks sometimes. That's why we fight to stay good." Days passed. The storm raged on, trapping them together in that cabin. Elias kept busy, chopping wood, melting snow for water, tending to her legs. Clara helped where she could, mending a torn sleeve or stirring the pot of stew when she was strong enough to sit up. In the evenings, they talked. She told him about her childhood in Missouri, how her father used to drink and beat her mother, how she'd run away west at 16 chasing promises that turned to dust. "Funny," she said one night, smiling faintly. "I came looking for freedom. Didn't realize it'd find me in a cabin on top of the world." Elias chuckled quietly. "Freedom don't live in towns. It lives where the sky don't end." Her laughter came soft and warm, and for the first time, he felt the weight in his chest ease a little. But their peace was short-lived. Down in Silverton Ridge, Royce Talbot had heard the whispers, that Elias Crane had taken Clara May, that the mountain man had made a fool of him in front of his own town. Royce didn't forgive insults. He didn't forget them either. He sent word to 3 men, His kind of men, the kind who'd shoot for a bottle of whiskey and a pocket of gold dust. Their names were Dirk Harlan, Amos Finch, and Little Jim Pike. He told them one thing: bring her back or put 'em both in the ground. Up in the valley. Clara had no idea death was already riding their trail. The days grew softer as the storm broke. The sun came out over the ridges, the snow glittering like silver dust. She could stand now with a stick for balance, her limp pronounced but her smile real. One morning she stepped outside, leaning on the doorframe, breathing in the clean air. "It's beautiful up here," she said. Elias was chopping wood nearby. "Ain't much," he said, "but it's honest." She looked at him then, really looked. The way the light caught his hair, the lines on his face, the quiet strength in the way he stood. She felt something she hadn't in years. Safe. "You gave me back my life," she whispered. He set the axe down, his eyes meeting hers. "No, Clara, you took it back yourself. I just helped you remember how." Before either could say another word, Boone raised his head and snorted. A warning. Elias froze. Years of wilderness living had taught him to listen to silence, and the woods had just gone too still. He reached for his rifle. "Get inside," he said lowly. "What is it?" "Riders, 3 of them. Coming fast." Clara's blood ran cold. "Royce's men?" "Likely." He loaded his rifle, checking the chamber. "Don't be scared, Clara. I've been through worse storms than this." She hobbled to the window and saw them, dark shapes moving through the snow, rifles glinting. Fear clawed at her chest. Elias positioned himself by the door, eyes narrowed. They'll find out soon enough what kind of man lives up here. As the first shot echoed through the valley, Clara prayed not for herself, but for the man who'd risked everything to save her. And in that frozen silence before the next gunfire, she understood something deep and eternal. Love in the wilderness wasn't tender or polite. It was raw, wild, and unbreakable. The valley was still before dawn, the kind of silence that presses against a man's skin and whispers of death. Elias Crane stood by the cabin door, his rifle steady in his hands, his breath fogging the cold air. Behind him the fire burned low, casting a faint orange glow across the rough log walls. Outside, the first rays of gray light crept across the snow, turning it to silver. Boone, his horse, pawed nervously at the ground near the corral. Elias could feel the tension in the air, the world holding its breath before violence. He knew they'd come. Royce Talbot's pride wouldn't allow him to let a woman walk away, not when the whole town knew he'd been defied. Royce was a coward, but he was rich, and rich men had a way of hiring guns to do their sins for them. Elias checked his rifle one last time, his thumb tracing the worn brass of the trigger. Inside, Clara sat in the chair by the hearth, clutching her shawl, her face pale but her eyes fierce. She'd seen pain enough in her life, but never this kind, the kind that comes with waiting for death. "Elias," she whispered, her voice breaking the silence. "Maybe you should go. You could still make it through the pass before they—" He turned sharply. "No, I ain't running. They're coming to kill you," she said, tears in her voice. "They're coming to kill us," he corrected softly. "And that's why they ain't leaving here alive." She looked at him, this mountain man who'd risked everything to save her, and felt her heart ache with a kind of love she'd never known. Fierce, unyielding, and terrifying. Outside, Boone snorted again, stamping the snow. Then came the sound Elias had been waiting for, the distant creak of saddle leather, the low murmur of voices. He glanced out the window. 3 riders moved through the pines, rifles slung across their backs. They dismounted near the frozen creek, their boots crunching softly. The leader, a tall man in a sheepskin coat, raised a hand and pointed toward the cabin. 3, Elias muttered, "just like I figured." He moved quickly, crouching beside the door, sighting down the rifle barrel through a small crack between the logs. Clara's fingers trembled as she reached for the small pistol he'd given her the night before. It was heavy in her hands, but she held it anyway. "Stay low," Elias murmured. The first shot came sudden and sharp, splitting the stillness like lightning. The bullet whistled past the cabin window, shattering glass and lodging in the far wall. Elias fired back instantly. His rifle cracked, echoing through the mountains. One of the gunmen fell face first into the snow, his hat tumbling beside him. The other 2 ducked behind the rocks by the creek. The fight had begun. For long minutes, the air filled with gunfire and smoke, the sharp scent of powder mixing with pine. Elias moved from window to door, reloading between shots, his movements sure and practiced. He'd been in fights before, against wolves, against outlaws, against the land itself, but this was different. This time he was fighting for something that mattered. When the shooting paused, he could hear the labored breathing of the two remaining men outside. Then came a voice, rough and mocking. "Crane, you got something that belongs to Mr. Talbot. Hand her over and we'll let you live." Elias's voice was calm but carried across the clearing. "You tell Talbot he's welcome to come fetch her himself." The voice cursed back. "Suit yourself. Hope you said your prayers." A shot rang out, shattering the edge of the cabin door. Elias fired again and ducked, splinters cutting his cheek. He felt the sting of a bullet graze his shoulder. It burned hot, wetting his sleeve with blood. Clara gasped. "Elias, you're hit!" He grunted. "Just a scratch." But the blood didn't lie. It was running fast down his arm, soaking the fur of his coat. Still, he didn't falter. He reloaded, braced his rifle against the doorframe, and waited. Outside, one of the gunmen, a skinny man with a ragged beard, crept around the back of the cabin, thinking to catch them from behind. Clara saw his shadow move across the window. "Elias," she hissed. "Behind you!" He turned too late. The back door burst open, the gunman raising his revolver. Clara didn't think. She lifted the pistol with both shaking hands and fired. The sound was deafening in the small cabin. The man staggered, a look of shock twisting across his face before he fell backward into the snow, the gun slipping from his hand. The pistol clattered to the floor as Clara dropped it, her arms trembling. Elias turned to her, stunned for only a heartbeat, then crossed the room and caught her by the shoulders. "You did good," he said hoarsely. "You did real good." She looked up at him through tears. "I didn't mean—" He shook his head. "You saved us both. Don't ever be sorry for that." Before she could answer, another shot ripped through the wall. The last gunman was closing in, the sound of his boots crunching through the snow outside. Elias crouched, gripping his rifle tight. He waited, listening. The steps came closer, closer, until the man's shadow passed the window. Elias swung the door open suddenly, rifle raised. The outlaw froze in shock, eyes wide. "Should have stayed in town," Elias said coldly, and fired. The man dropped without a word. Silence fell again over the valley, broken only by the soft hiss of snow falling from the trees. The smoke from Elias's rifle drifted upward, caught by the wind. Inside, Clara sank to her knees, her face buried in her hands. She was shaking, her whole body trembling with the release of fear and relief. Elias knelt beside her, wincing as his wounded shoulder throbbed. "It's over," he murmured. "They won't be coming back." She looked up at him, eyes wide. "You're bleeding," he smiled faintly. "You're walking. Guess we're even." She laughed through her tears, the sound trembling and pure. He tore a strip from his shirt and pressed it against the wound, then guided her to the chair by the fire. When dawn finally broke, it painted the snow in soft gold. The three bodies outside lay half-covered by the storm. A few hours later, the sheriff's posse came riding up the trail, drawn by the gunfire. Sheriff Dugan was an old man with kind eyes and a worn badge. He looked over the scene, taking in the bodies, the bullet holes, the blood. Then he turned to Elias, who stood in the doorway with Clara beside him. "Looks like trouble found you, Crane and Yar," the sheriff said quietly. Elias nodded. Didn't have far to look. Dugan eyed the dead men, then the rifle in Elias's hands. "These all Talbot's doing?" Elias didn't answer, just gave a slow nod. The sheriff sighed. "Royce has gone too far this time. The town's sick of him. Maybe it's time someone stood up to the bastard." He tipped his hat. "You two stay put. I'll see to the rest." As the posse rode off, Elias closed the door and turned back to Clara. She was watching him with that same look she'd given him the first night in the saloon. Soft, grateful, and full of something unspoken. He smiled faintly. "Told you we'd see the sun come up again." She stepped toward him, her hand rising to touch his cheek, her thumb brushing the faint cut from the fight. "You could have left me," she whispered. He shook his head. "I ain't the leaving kind." The fire crackled behind them, filling the room with warmth. Outside, the snow gleamed red where it had mixed with blood. But inside, for the first time in years, Elias Crane felt peace. And as Clara rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, she knew something with absolute certainty. Even in a world that broke people for kindness, love was the one thing that could not be killed. The snow melted slow that spring, as if the mountains themselves were reluctant to give up their white shroud. The valley where Elias Crane lived grew green again, soft with new grass and whispering pines. The creek that once ran silent under ice now sang loud and free, and for the first time in months, laughter came from the cabin on the ridge. Clara could walk again, haltingly, with a cane Elias had carved for her, but she walked. The scars on her legs were pale reminders of pain she no longer carried. The mountain air had healed her as surely as Elias's steadfastness had. She stood one morning by the window, sunlight spilling through her hair. Elias was outside splitting logs, his shirt sleeves rolled up, the muscles in his arms flexing with each strike. She watched him, and in that quiet hour, she thought of everything that had brought her here, how she'd been a saloon maid no one respected, broken and discarded, and how a man the world called savage had been the only one to see her worth. He came in after a while, brushing snowmelt and pine needles from his boots. "Fire's low," he said, setting another log on the hearth. "Weather's turnin'. Might get rain by nightfall." Clara smiled faintly. "You always talk about the weather when you're thinking too hard." He paused, caught, and gave a slow grin. "Maybe. Got a lot on my mind, I reckon." She tilted her head. "About what?" He looked into the fire for a moment before speaking. "Sheriff Dugan came by yesterday. Said Royce Talbot's finally left town. Took what was left of his money and headed east. Town's quiet now. Folks talk different when fear's gone." "That's good news," she said softly. Elias nodded but didn't smile. "Ain't sure it changes much for us," she frowned. "Why's that?" "'Cause sooner or later," he said, "men like Talbot come back. Maybe not him, but someone like him. There'll always be folks who think people like you and me ain't worth much." Clara stepped closer. "You think I care what they think?" He met her gaze, those dark mountain eyes meeting her steady blue ones. "No," he said quietly. "But I do." She touched his arm. "Then stop. You saved me, Elias. You gave me a life. You think I could ever be ashamed of that?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out something small wrapped in cloth. When he unwrapped it, the firelight caught the silver gleam of a ring. Simple, hand-forged, rough at the edges, but beautiful in its honesty. "I made this," he said. "Ain't fancy. Don't shine like town jewelry. But it'll last." Clara stared, her breath catching. "Elias." He took her hand gently, his calloused fingers trembling. "I ain't never been good with words. Don't know much about courtship or how decent folks do things, but I know I don't want to see another sunrise without you beside me." Her eyes filled with tears. "You want me to marry you?" He gave a slow nod. "If you'll have me." She laughed softly, tears slipping down her cheeks. "You think I came all this way just to say no?" He smiled, really smiled, for the first time in a long while. Then he slid the ring onto her finger, and though it was a little too big, it caught the firelight like a promise. Outside, the wind rose through the pines, carrying the faint scent of rain. They were married 2 days later under a cottonwood tree by the creek. Sheriff Dugan came up the mountain to read the vows, his old voice shaking in the crisp air. Boone stood tethered nearby, flicking his tail, and a few deer watched from the tree line as if curious to see what kind of fools these humans were, making forever promises under an open sky. When Dugan said the final words, "So long as you both shall live," Clara looked up at Elias, and the world seemed to stop around them. His rough hands cradled her face, and when he kissed her, it wasn't the kind of kiss you find in stories. It was raw, real, full of everything they'd endured. When it ended, he whispered, "Reckon that makes it official." She smiled through her tears. "Reckon it does." They built their life in the high country after that. The world below went on, miners digging, gamblers cheating, saloons filling every night. But up in that lonely valley, peace held. Clara tended a garden that somehow thrived in the mountain soil. Elias hunted and traded pelts with the trappers who came through. Sometimes, at night, they'd sit by the fire and talk about the past, the saloon, the beating, the day she confessed her shame and he refused to turn away. "I used to think," she said once, "that pain was all I'd ever know. That kindness was for other people." He looked at her quietly, his thumb tracing the edge of her jaw. Maybe kindness finds folks when they stop looking for it. Another time, she asked him, "Do you ever miss the world below?" He shook his head. "World down there's too loud. Up here I can hear your heartbeat." In the fall, they took a trip down to town for supplies. People stared when they walked through the streets. Elias, the big mountain man with the scar across his cheek, and Clara, the woman they once pitied, now walking tall beside him. At the general store, Mrs. Combs, who used to whisper about Clara's past, offered her a jar of preserves with a nervous smile. "It's good to see you again." "Mrs. Crane," she said. Clara blinked at the name, then smiled. "Good to be seen." When they left town, Elias noticed her smile lingered all the way up the mountain trail. "You like that?" He teased. "Being called Mrs. Crane?" she said, grinning. "I surely did." As winter crept back across the peaks, Elias built a new barn, and Clara stitched curtains for the windows. The cabin became more than a shelter. It became a home. One evening, snow fell soft and steady outside. Clara sat by the fire mending his shirt when Elias came in from the cold. He hung his coat, brushed off the snow, and stood for a moment just watching her. She looked up, puzzled. "What?" He shook his head, smiling faintly. "Just thinking how I used to come home to silence. Now I come home to you." She rose, crossed the room, and took his hands. "And you'll always come home to me, Elias, always." He leaned down, kissed her forehead, and they stood there together, the firelight painting them in gold and shadow. Outside, the snow piled high against the door and the wind sang through the pines, but inside, love burned steady and warm, defying the cold world beyond. Years later, travelers passing through the high country would sometimes see smoke curling from that same cabin, and hear laughter echo faintly down the slopes. Some said the man who lived there was part legend, a recluse who'd once defied a powerful man for love. Others said the woman who walked beside him had once been broken, and now walked stronger than most men. But those who knew the truth said it plain. They were just two souls who'd found each other in a cruel world and refused to let go. And when the first snow fell each year, Elias would hold Clara close by the fire, look out across the white valley and whisper, "Reckon heaven looks a lot like this."